We have with us Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, President of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies. Prof, thank you for joining us.
Yes, good morning Angelo and good morning Angela. Good morning to everyone.
All right, Prof, one of the big news items that came out over the weekend, of course, yung nangyari sa Venezuela. From a security perspective no, sa international community, gaano ka-significant ito, the way they removed the president sa Venezuela?
For me, this is the biggest security issue in the 21st century thus far because it raises a lot of issues about the current world order. It is not only about the arrest of President Maduro, but also the emergence of a new world order because apparently, under the current situation, President Trump's decision to attack Venezuela is undermining the very core concept of state sovereignty and internal affairs to the non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states.
All right. Well, we know naman no, that of course, President Maduro has been long a dictator and a very vicious one. Ang issue kasi dito is who decides moving forward daw kung sino ang presidenteng kailangan tanggalin o hindi. But definitely, sabi nila, yung people of Venezuela need a democracy. But sino magiging arbiter ngayon moving forward?
Well, that begs the question now because the action of the United States is being questioned not only by the international community, but also by the American public also. You see, some American legislators are questioning the decision of Trump because it fails to get the approval of the U.S. Congress on the use of military force against foreign country. So now it challenges the very idea of international world order that we created after Second World War. The principle of the post-World War II international order was to uphold international law in order to maintain international peace and security on the basis of respect for the sovereignty of all states. But now, it's under challenge. Now, it's no longer the use of law, but the use of force. So the question now is, who will account the United States for doing such kind of action? So let's see. We are also contemplating on that as scholars of international relations.
That's right.
We are reflecting on the various consequences of U.S. actions against Venezuela.
Before I move on to Asia, ang tanong ko dito kasi, Prof, parang hindi rin naman ito bago sa ginawa ng US before. You have Libya, you have the invasion, you have also Iraq, no? But wala masyadong pushback from these movements because they removed also dictators. Bakit medyo nag-iba ang pananaw ngayon ng international community when Maduro has been likened to these leaders who were removed?
Yes, so now it demonstrates that under the current leadership of Donald Trump, it's realism in international politics. It's we call it the real politics now. It's because the U.S. can do it.
Yeah, that's right.
It has the capability to do what it did in Venezuela.
That's right.
Now the question is, who will account the U.S. for doing such if it offends the position of other sovereign states. So it's a challenge to existing international order, and it is also a challenge to existing political order in the United States. So it's challenging a lot of things that we know in international politics. So we scholars are seriously monitoring the outcome of U.S. action.
But what happens now in Venezuela? While, you know, Trump said, no, U.S. will run Venezuela, but even the Vice President ng Venezuela, sinasabi niya, they still recognize Maduro as their president. And how come ang U.S.-backed opposition ay hindi sinusuportahan ni Trump ngayon?
Yes, so now there's also a domestic political dynamics in Venezuela as far as that is concerned. So So we don't know whether the current government in Venezuela, led by the interim president, will mobilize the armed forces to resist U.S. action or to resist further U.S. military activities in Venezuela, because Trump says that it wants to rule Venezuela in order to control the development of oil and also of vital minerals of Venezuela. So let's see whether this will lead to interstate military conflict between U.S. and Venezuela, and whether the international community will support Venezuela. Because right now, there are important states calling for the United States to release Maduro and respect the sovereignty of Venezuelan government.
Yeah, even kasi
Like China, Russia, and even Brazil.
Oo, even his custody 'di ba? Tinatanong saan ba siya dapat makulong?
Yes, yes. So, we can see here also double standard on the part of Donald Trump, that while it resists dictatorship of Maduro, it continues to support also and forging friendly relations with other dictators in the world.
North
so
Korea.
There's Trump is making a lot of mixed signals that makes the world, many world leaders now, in utter confusion.
But
Yes, go ahead.
But do you also believe what other analysts are saying, that this is just all about controlling the oil reserves of Venezuela, all about petrodollar?
Well, that's one important angle. It's about the control of oil and also the control of petrodollars in Latin America. But also, there are also other geopolitical implications like major power relationship. Okay? Because right now, China is expanding its influence in Latin America by implementing a lot of Belt and Road initiatives in Latin America and engaging Latin America very, very closely, especially in the context of BRICS. So, mobilizing Brazil as the leader in Latin America. Now, with U.S. action in Venezuela, U.S. is giving a strong signal to China that Latin America is under American influence. And it is consistent with the current national security strategy of the United States under Trump, when it prioritizes control of Western Hemisphere in its national security strategy.
That's it's mabuti, Prof, na nabanggit mo yan. No? Kasi if you look at the geopolitical map, parang ang labanan ngayon, painting the map between red and blue. Madaming mga scenarios. But ang tanong ko dito, do you see Trump moving in on the Americas this time? Kasi nag-veer away na siya from politics, geopolitics from the Middle East
Yes. So, from pivot to Asia of Barack Obama that lasted until the Biden administration, Trump is now focusing his attention in the Western Hemisphere, covering largely Latin America and North America. So, that's the priority of Trump, because Trump is very pragmatic also. He sees the potential of Venezuela in ensuring the oil supply and meeting the oil needs of the United States, and making the petrodollar strong because its influence in the Arab world is declining. So it is expanding its influence in Latin America. And we already know that Venezuelan oil reserve represents 1/5 of the total oil reserves in the world. So controlling Venezuela is also controlling the supply of oil in the global market.
I wanted to ask you now, while there is an outcry, individual outcry of different leaders sa ginawa ni President Trump, pero parang walang condemnation ginawa ang NATO and G7. Kasi alam natin,
haven't heard anything.
critical tong G7 if they back the US. Then, sabi nila, you might see more sweeping, anong word? Invasion ba? Or sweeping arrests of dictators along Central America?
Well, because we all know that NATO is under the operational control of the United States.
That's right.
NATO will be useless without the United States. So don't
That's true.
expect a lot from NATO and don't expect a lot from G7. But what I'm expecting is for European states to also take a stand because it took strongly against Russia when it took military actions against Ukraine. And there's also a similarity that U.S. is taking control of Venezuela, although Russia and Russian action in Ukraine has different history with American action in Venezuela. But the question here now is the use of force. Okay, the use of force
Yeah.
arbitrarily without domestic support and international approval.
Yun nga
Because remember,
oh.
during the global war on terrorism, when the United States declared a war against Afghanistan, it requested the approval of the UN Security Council to take military action. Okay. So
Yeah.
we need that kind of situation. That's why as we speak now, the UN Security Council will meet today to address the current situation now in Venezuela.
Okay, so having said that, Prof, does this situation set precedent naman or precedent for the future U.S. action toward other contested regimes?
I'm not worried about American future actions. I'm also worried about the future actions of other major powers that
Yeah.
it can be done. That
Yeah,
it can
yeah,
be
yeah.
done. China can do it, Russia
Oo.
can do it, India can do it. So it gives example to other major powers that if you have military wherewithal to use force in order to advance your own interest,
Yeah.
then you can do it.
So parang it's...
So,
oo.
so I'm more worried about the actions of other major powers as a
Right.
result of this precedent.
Oo, so parang we can look at it this way as well. It legitimizes kung ano yung ginagawa ng Russia sa Ukraine. Can we look at
Well,
that way?
for me, it's not about a question of legitimacy because there's no legitimacy on the use of force.
Mm.
But it normalizes the use of force in
Yeah.
international affairs. So,
For-
because for me, it's not legitimate to use the use of
Yeah.
force. It's
Exactly.
always
Yeah, yeah,
legitimate
yeah,
to use force. But it normalizes the practice of the use of force in
Yeah, that's the
international
word.
affairs.
Well, Prof, one angle na tinitignan ng domestic lawmakers sa US is now that, well, they've done this move already, it was hugely unpopular. What if they install a marshal, a military marshal over at Venezuela to oversee an election to be called and then have the people decide? Because if you look, may international outcry, pero if you look at yung domestic reaction, parang majority ng mga regular citizens of Venezuela have supported the move of the US to free them from the so-called dictator. So, is an election now the best move para just to para matapos na tong issue?
Well, again, it's more complicated than we see it. Domestically in Venezuela, it's more complicated than that because we know that there are forces in Venezuela against any type of dictatorship because they want democracy to experience in Venezuela. But at the same time, it also questions the actions of the United States for taking military force to remove what is called a dictator without the approval of the American Congress. So by doing that arbitrarily, then Trump is showing a genre of dictatorship also. So that's why it's more complicated than we view. That's why it's very difficult to make any informed conclusion now because events are still unfolding and there are many consequences not only for international peace and security but also for domestic security of Venezuela as well as domestic security in the United States and also regional security not only in the Western Hemisphere but also in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, we have yet to see the official statement coming from ASEAN, but I'm glad to read the official statement now of the Philippine government released by the Department of Foreign Affairs that it is conforming with the principle of international law and respect for sovereignty of state and non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states.
Well, yun nga rin yung gusto namin itanong sa inyo, Prof. Given that the US is our ally, diba, dapat ba nagsasalita rin tayo against this, no? Because we're looking at this not para dun sa ano natin dun sa whatever that we should be gaining about this, ano? So dapat ba nagsasalita ang Pilipinas regarding this?
Yes, the Philippine government should take a strong stand on the actions of the U.S. in Venezuela. And for me, this situation should also trigger us to make a rethinking of our alliance with the United States. Do we want to be associated with a state that uses that arbitrarily uses military force against a sovereign state? So it calls for a rethinking of our alliance with the United States, and I have seen some scholars and some analysts also, and I'm also talking to some of my colleagues about the timeliness of this situation for the Philippines to rethink our alliance with the United States. Is it a kind of practice that we want to normalize in international politics, or we want to go back to the principle of the United Nations when it was created, okay, right after the Second World War? Okay, and what is the Charter of the United Nations? It's very loud and clear. Self-restraint on the use of military force, respect for the sovereignty of states, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states.
Right.
Those are loud and clear. And rather than use military force to resolve conflict, the United Nations Charter urges all states to use diplomacy, okay, in settling international disputes.
Paano kasi, Prof, how about yung, well, you're saying na we should take a neutral stance muna in our alliance with the US. Ang problema natin kasi we also have a spat with China, who is similarly using the same, well, not the same, but a amount of force to bully us in the West Philippine Sea. Now, if we veer away from the US and other Western powers na ka-ally ng US, where do we stand now? What happens then to us?
Well, we can analyze the situation in the context of the South China Sea, and it shows, it shows that if U.S. decides to use its military force to assert its interest in the South China Sea, then it can do it, because right now China cannot count the United States for its actions in Venezuela. It's only like a moral suasion, asking the United States to release Maduro, to respect international law. So it's like a moral suasion. But China now, it reveals the weakness of China, that China does not have equivalent military force to prevent the U.S. from what it did in Venezuela. So if the U.S. decides to use military force in the South China Sea, if the U.S. decides to use military force in Taiwan, then it has the wherewithal. Now, the thinking now for China, if U.S. uses military force in the South China Sea, or more so in Taiwan, okay, can China retaliate also militarily? So that begs the question. But for me, I'm very much worried about that situation, because we are hosting American military facilities in Philippine territories, and the United States can mobilize all these American military facilities to advance its military interest not only in the Asia Pacific but also in the whole world. So the Philippines will be dragged in a conflict that not of our own choosing. Okay, so if U.S. decides to involve in any military conflict in the Asia Pacific, the Philippines will be involved because of our existing alliance, and it applies not only to the Philippines but also to Australia, to Japan, to South Korea. So I am closely watching the actions of Australia, South Korea, Japan, and other allies in the Asia Pacific region, whether or not they approve this kind of military action in Venezuela.
Well, of course, some people cannot help but compare such arrest kay former President Rodrigo Duterte. But of course, the way we are seeing this, yung pag-arrest naman kay kay Pangulong Duterte ay may involvement ng ICC. Ganun po ba 'yon?
Well, for me, it's not only about comparing it with the arrest of President Duterte, but we can go back as far as early as 1996.
I'm sorry, Prof, we didn't hear that.
We can trace it as early as 1986 when the United States decided to quote-unquote kidnap the Marcos family and brought it to its nearest military base in Guam. It happened in 1986 also. A regime change, and the U.S. took military action by ferrying the Marcos family to Guam. Okay.
Wait, you said
So,
kidnap. That's a strong word. Pero di ba parang alam natin is they ask help from the
Well,
US?
that's why I said quote-unquote, because that was the term used by one of the families,
So, Prof, I'd like
members
to,
of the family.
Prof, I'd like to ask about the UN. No? While you mentioned kasi ang role ng UN after the World War was to establish a world order and to make sure that each country respects each rule of law and sovereign as a sovereign, independent sovereign nation. Ang question dito, ang dami nagsasabi that the UN also has failed in many ways to protect the human being at the grassroots level. Na you look at nations around the world, not only Venezuela but around the world, ang daming bansa na sa Africa pa lang where the human being or the are persecuted politically, and the UN always mentions let's just respect and resolve this domestically. Sabi nga nila for evil to flourish, it's for good men to do nothing. Ang pinaka question dito is should the UN rethink its mandate on how to deal with nations that are oppressing their own people?
Well, right now, UN is in continuous rethinking of its original mandate in 1945.
Yes, that's
so
right.
it continues. But regarding the situation that you mentioned in Africa and other parts of the world with existing internal armed conflict, remember the UN also made a lot of innovation also by sending peacekeeping forces and at the same time implementing principles like responsibility to protect. That if the states are failed states, then the international community has the moral responsibility to get involved internally in order to protect civilians from existing conflicts. So it's very unfair to make such kind of conclusion against the United Nations because, yeah, we know the UN is not a perfect international organization, but the world will be more dangerous without the United Nations. So, is that the kind of world do we want to go back to a situation when there is no international organization upholding this kind of principle? So, let's see, because the actions of the United States in Venezuela is in fact challenging the very principle that the U.S. erected right after the Second World War.
Actually, the pushback sa UN was not so much to remove them or to being unfair to them. I think the pushback against the UN was saying that they should rethink or strengthen yung ngipin ng UN to be a more powerful organization that can really control what's happening in terms of the world order. Kasi let's face it, hindi nila kaya ang United States at this point.
You know, Angela, I am teaching international politics and teaching both theories and practice of international relations. UN is an intergovernmental organization, and it cannot do a lot when it comes to the sovereignty of a state. So the reality of international politics as we speak is, in fact, the reality is anarchy. There's an international anarchy, and the UN is trying to address the harsh effect of this international anarchy. And American action in Venezuela only reaffirms that international politics is in the state of international anarchy. Then the question is, do we want this international anarchy to prevail at the expense of the sovereign state? That's the reason why they created the UN. You know, the UN is a product of what I call idealism in international politics. What is the idealism? That the world can be, that we can maintain international peace and security, that we can prevent international war, that all states can coexist, okay? Yung concept of peaceful coexistence, that wars can be ended, okay? And if cannot be ended, wars can be prevented, okay? So right now, we need to renew our debate on the need for preventive diplomacy to be discussed again in international relations, because we cannot afford to normalize this kind of practice.
Actually,
because if this practice is normalized, then that will not prevent other major powers to do the same.
Yeah, actually, we're not saying naman ino-normalize, but we're finding ways to strengthen the UN because we want a strong UN, of course, para walang umiibabaw ng tulad ng US and ano. Kasi paano natin papalakasin ng UN, Prof?
Again, there are many proposals already. There are many proposals, and one is to reform the UN Security Council and to reform the Secretariat, and also to reform the whole structure of the UN. We need a one semester to do that. So, there are many reforms being discussed now, but implementing this reform takes time, because we are dealing with sovereign states, and the UN is not a supranational organization like the European Union. It is still an intergovernmental organization, meaning it is an organization of sovereign states. So implementing this reform really takes slow.
Okay.
But UN is trying to reform itself, and the reform started even during the time of Kofi Annan, or even Boutros Ghali. There are many proposals already to strengthen the United Nations.
Okay.
But right now is that American action in Venezuela is undermining the relevance of the United Nations.
Okay. Well, lastly, Prof, as we question what US has done to Venezuela, of course, pinag-uusapan natin kanina pa yung sinabi ni Trump that they will run Venezuela government for the meantime. Of course, yung tanong dito about the oil reserve ng Venezuela. So what happens now then? Because the US, according to Trump, sabi nila, they will take over even yung pagkuha nga ng oil reserve sa Venezuela. So can they actually do that? And what happens?
If the US will really do that, it will really threaten the principle of sovereignty. Because Venezuela should be run not by the United States, but by the Venezuelan people. So do we want other countries to run Myanmar? Do we want other countries to run the Philippines? We want Filipinos to run the Philippines. We want Venezuelans to run Venezuela. Okay.
But who will stop
We
the
want
US?
the Americans to run the United States of America. So if the US decides to run Venezuela against the will of the Venezuelan people, for me, that's classic colonialism.
Well, the question is, diba, who will stop them? Because
And if its interest is to control the resources of Venezuela, for me, that's vintage American imperialism.
all right, with that,
Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, President of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies.
Thank you, Angela and Angelo. God bless you.